All right. So in the book, you kind of set everything up by going through confirmation bias, black and white thinking, and then you get to the ladder of misinference, which is so cool. Can you describe what the ladder of misinference is?
Yeah, so why did I come up with this to begin with? Is before I wrote my book, I read other books about misinformation, and they were good. I'm not going to attack them because I view them as rival books, but they were so good and they were so comprehensive that they came up with the 263 ways in which we can be misinformed. And then it's difficult for a reader to remember all 263 and to put them into practice. So I wanted to boil down all the types of misinformation into just four categories so that it's easy to put into practice. And those four I display in a graphic called the ladder of misinference. So why a ladder? Well, when we start from some statements and we draw some conclusions from them, we are climbing a ladder. But why I call it the ladder of misinference, which is obviously a play on the ladder of inference, is that sometimes the steps that we make when we draw conclusions from raw data are incorrect. And so let me just talk through for now the first step. So the first step is a statement is not fact. It may not be accurate. So what I mean by this is we quote statements all the time as if they were the gospel truth. So culture eats strategy for breakfast. Peter Drucker said this, so it needs to be true because he was a management guru. But it may not be the gospel truth. And indeed, in that case, there's two issues at least. The first is that Peter Drucker never said that. And so this is a misattributed quote. And second, and more seriously, even if he had said that, it doesn't mean that it's true. Because where is the evidence that culture always beats strategy? Yes, he is a famous management guru, but that doesn't mean that everything that comes out of his mouth is correct. There's a lot of famous people, I'm sure the listener can think about, who says things which are not correct. So what we'd actually want to look at is there evidence behind that statement? Has there been a careful study of the link between culture and strategy and performance? And even if there isn't hard evidence, this doesn't mean that what he says is definitely incorrect, but rather than Peter Drucker states, proves that culture eats strategy for breakfast, we will say, well, in his subjective opinion, culture is more important than strategy. We will still put some weight on that because he's a guru, but this doesn't mean that strategy is irrelevant, which is how some people have interpreted that black and white statement.
Some of the examples you have of statements that are just not true, but have persisted for a long time are kind of mind blowing. There's actually one that I don't think was in your book that I was reading about recently about how lottery winners tend to go bankrupt, or a large proportion of them. That's another one of these that's just, there's no basis for that. Somebody said it once and it was attributed to a study that was never done, but now people believe it to be true. And you've got a bunch of examples like this in the book. Can you talk about where the famous 10,000 hour rule for mastery comes from?
Yeah, so this was from a best-selling book by Malcolm Gladwell called Outliers, and the popular version of the rule is 10,000 hours is the key to success. You can be successful in anything that you want to as long as you invest 10,000 hours into studying or practicing it. And immediately this plays on confirmation bias. We want this to be true, and we think it's true because we're taught from a young age that practice makes perfect. You can do anything that you set your mind to. And this is empowering. So this suggests that the world is your oyster. You don't need to be limited by your genetics or your past background. And I had to admit in the book that I myself had taught this to my students at Wharton. Why? I'm a finance professor. What has this got to do in finance? Well, at the end of my final lecture, because I start teaching right at the start of the MBA, then my final half an hour at the end of my final class is looking forward to the rest of the 2 years, and I give some advice. And one of them was the 10,000 hours rule, which is that to do an MBA, you can push yourself outside your comfort zone, you can redefine yourself. Maybe historically you always worked on quantitative factors, but now you can become a leader, a master negotiator, and public speaker as long as you put your time in. And when I said that, I would get a lot of nods. People would say, oh, that was an inspirational, empowering speech. But then later on, I found that the evidence for this was really, really weak. So Gladwell claims that this rule applies in every context, yet the evidence he cites is limited to just violin playing. And what works in violin playing may well not work in public speaking or neurosurgery. But even worse, that study never measured 10,000 hours and it never measured success, which is a bit of a problem if you think that 10,000 hours is the secret to success. Well, first, how did it not measure hours? So all it did is it asked people to report the hours that they had practiced since age 5. Now, these violinists were currently 23 years old. So they had to remember from age 5, 18 years ago, how much you practiced. You may well not remember how much you practiced last week. And so here is the problem, is if you were successful right now, you might well say, yeah, I probably did practice a lot to get here. I had to work hard. You don't want to say, oh, I was just born with it and was lucky. And conversely, if you're not successful, you won't say I practiced a lot when I was young, because then you'd have to admit that this was all a waste of time. So it could be of everything. If anything, success leads to higher reported hours rather than hours leading to success. These are just self-reports. But another issue is it never measures success, not in any objective manner. It just asks the teachers at this violin academy who has the greatest potential to, in the future, play at a good orchestra. And here, it may well be that, let's say, the teachers knew how much the students practiced. Probably if you know a student practices a lot, you will probably say, yeah, I think he or she will be successful. If somebody's goofing off and not showing up, you'll probably say that they will be unsuccessful. So for something which claims to study the link between practice and success, it doesn't measure actual practice, but memories of practice 18 years ago. It doesn't measure actual success, but a subjective evaluation.
Yeah, that's wild. And that statistic is like so commonly cited, which is wild. So there's another one that was pretty striking. There's a book that a lot of people have read, Why We Sleep. Can you talk about the example from that book?
Yeah, so this book, Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker, by Dr. Matthew Walker, because he stresses on the front cover his scientific credentials, argues that sleep is the secret to success. We're in a national or global sleep epidemic. People are not sleeping enough. And again, this confirms what we want to be true. We want an excuse to sleep more because it's going to lead to greater physical health, greater mental alertness. And we would like to believe that our over-eager beaver colleagues who wake up at 5 a.m., they will get their comeuppance. And what might their comeuppance be? Well, maybe if they're not fully alert, they might just have accidents. And indeed, there is a graph which shows the more you sleep, the fewer the accidents. If you sleep for 9 hours, you have fewer than 8. That's fewer than 7, fewer than 6. Yet if you go to the underlying paper behind this, it shows a quite different graph. It has another bar for 5 hours of sleep, and those people who sleep for 5 hours have fewer injuries than 6. They also have fewer injuries than 7. But because Matthew Walker doesn't like that, he cuts this out of the graph. He just shows something which is really selected. And even though, so you think that this is a book founded on lots of data and evidence. Again, it's by this Dr. Matthew Walker who goes out of the way to stress his credentials. And yet there's a lot of errors in this, and this is only one of many errors in the book. There's an entire blog post by Alexei Guzzi on why the book Why We Sleep is riddled with scientific errors. And so again, even if something is said to be based on data and science, you could just be quoting selectively, going so far as to cut out a bar of a graph because it doesn't support your viewpoint. That is just like a police officer hiding some evidence because it exonerates his suspect.
Yeah, that one's crazy because you show the chart from Why We Sleep and then you show the chart from the paper, and it's like in the Why We Sleep, it shows this monotonic relationship, which is completely destroyed by the actual chart from the paper, which is like, I mean, yeah, like you said, it's like hiding evidence. How is something that egregious not flagged by like an editor or a fact checker?
It's because people just may not want it to be true. So if you are an editor, you might think, okay, this is a guy with strong scientific credentials. So another thing is Matthew Walker misrepresents his scientific credentials. So he said he had a PhD from the prestigious Medical Research Council of the UK. There's no such council which ever gives any degree. So this gives you grants. it doesn't give you a PhD. He's got his PhD, I think, from the University of Newcastle. That's an okay university. It's not Oxford or Cambridge or London and so on. So that is also misrepresented. But people might think, okay, this is a guy who's got great credentials. He's quoted a paper. If you quote something, you don't have the time to go through and look up every evidence. You might trust him. But I think what is even more surprising or more disappointing is even after all of these issues have been raised on this very long article critiquing his book, nobody's really changed their opinion. Because they say, okay, well, despite all of that, it's my gut feel which thinks that sleep is still important, or my lived personal experience suggests the more I sleep, the more alert that I'm going to be. But again, this is sort of mixing up correlation and causation, right? Why are you able to sleep a lot? It's probably that lots of other things in your life are going well. So yes, in the periods I'm sleeping more, then I'm probably going to be happier. But because lack of stress means I'm going to sleep more. In the periods in which I'm not sleeping, it's because I'm having to juggle loads of other things. Right now, I just had another child a month ago, and maybe that is going to cause a lot of stress and a lot of busyness, not necessarily the lack of sleep. Similarly, this might happen with political outcomes. So in the Brexit referendum, where the UK voted to leave the European Union, there was an incorrect claim posted on the side of a bus that the European Union cost the UK £350 million per year. That was a sum which was completely exaggerated. When that was corrected, people said, oh, well, that never influenced my viewpoint anyway. I would have voted the same way. But you would say that because you don't want to admit that you were misled by something. So once you have a particular opinion, even after there is some disconfirming evidence, people are not changing their view. So this is the often quoted phrase that a lie has gone halfway around the world before the truth has laced up his or her shoes, is once something has gone viral, people stick to it, even if there's disconfirming evidence.
Yeah, sleep's a tough one. I do like to sleep. How should people verify whether a statement is actually based on a fact?
So one thing is actually just to try to search for this, try to search for disconfirming evidence. So if you were to look at Why We Sleep errors, or you might look at this in any type of popular book, 10,000 Rule Critique, then you might find this. And so while I've talked about the dangers of getting information from the internet because there might be less trusted sources, on the other hand, what it does mean is we do have access to a wide source of information. And even if somebody who might not be a massive household name like Alexei Guzzi, even if he's a serious researcher and has done his homework, this is something that it will come out with. So try to find something which is disconfirming. Sometimes it may well be as simple as just going to the underlying article. Now, I don't expect people to go through every single word of a scientific paper on sleep, but just to look at that picture, you can just see that that picture is very different from the picture that was ended up being quoted.
So those are examples of how a statement may not actually be based on a fact. How is a fact, once it's been verified, how is a fact not data?
Yeah, so this is the second step of the ladder of misinference. So you might think, okay, what Alex has said is a statement, it's not fact. Let's check the facts. Now, if we know that something is a fact, are we home and dry? Well, the answer is no, because even if something is 100% true fact, it could be cherry picked. It might be the exception that does not prove the rule. So one example is Simon Sinek's book, Start With Why, which claims that having a why is the secret to success. And he gives a number of facts to back this up. For example, Apple started with why, and Apple is extremely successful. There's no denying that. And he also gives other facts, other anecdotes. For example, it applies in the non-profit sector. Wikipedia, extremely successful. It applies to individuals. So the Wright brothers, they were the first to have a test-powered flight. But all of these things could be cherry-picked. So they could well be hundreds of other companies, or non-profits, or individuals, that also started with why, and they failed, but we never hear about them because Simon Sinek will never tell you about this. So this is the difference between fact and data. So facts are individual stories, data is something which is large scale. And the issue here is not just authors like Simon Sinek, the issue could be business school professors. So I'm saying this as much to myself as I am to the reader, is that in business schools we like to teach with case studies, but how do you choose a case study? You choose the most vivid and striking example of the particular point that you want to show. So it may well be a company which was sustainable in a pioneer in that and had massive performance, whereas there might be others which are sustainable companies who failed. So I do use stories and I do use case studies in my teaching and in my books, but when I do use them, I always try to make sure that it's backed up by large-scale evidence. So for me, I start with the large-scale evidence and I find a story which brings that evidence to light. And then sequentially, yes, I lead with the story first and then go to the evidence to back it up immediately afterwards. But often what people will do will just find a story which supports that viewpoint, find other examples that support that viewpoint as well, but they won't do a systematic study of the large-scale evidence.
What are the steps involved with separating fact from data?
So what you'd want is something similar to a randomized control trial in medicine. So what happens there? So you would take a number of patients and they're all suffering from some affliction. You give some of them a treatment, a drug or a behavioral intervention, see how many get better and how many get worse, and give others a placebo and see how many get better and how many get worse. And you compare the two. But importantly, your data set needs to contain people who took the drug and still got worse. That's companies that started with Y and yet they failed, but they will never be in any Simon Sinek book. And similarly, you need companies that did not. You need people who took the placebo and yet they still got better. That's like companies that did not start with Y and yet they still succeeded. But again, you don't see this in any Simon Sinek book. So he will only show you the examples that support his viewpoint, the companies that started with Y and succeeded. And even if those examples are 100% fact, it's what he is not telling you, which is where all the action lies. All of these other companies that started with Y and failed, and all of these companies that succeeded without the Y. And why is that so striking? It suggests that misinformation is really hard to police. So some people might think, oh, why is it not the government stepping in and prosecuting it? To one of your earlier questions, Ben, why don't editors come out and check this? But the issue is not what you publish and what you disclose being incorrect. Maybe what you're saying is correct, but it's what you're hiding, which is where all the action lies. And it's really difficult to prosecute Simon Sinek for not telling you about all of the counterexamples. He could claim he just never knew of those counterexamples, perhaps because he engaged in bias search.
So the Simon Sinek example kind of touches on this, but what role do narratives play in how people interpret or misinterpret facts?
A substantial role. So this is the idea of the narrative fallacy, which is even if there is no relationship between two factors, if there is even if you can weave in a compelling story, that story is memorable, and then we perceive a link when there is no link. And again, this is deeply ingrained with us because even before we had writing, it would be the oral tradition, people passed on information through stories. So the narrative that Simon Sinek weaves in is, well, if you have a why, people will buy into this, it inspires people. People buy Apple products not because of what they do, but because of why they do it. They buy it because Apple has this vision and this purpose. Now, if you were just to look at that statement with a clear head, that sounds crazy. That's a load of rubbish. Why do you buy Apple products? Because of their functionality, because they work, because they have the apps, because of the reviews, because other people will have iPhones. They work. I don't really know why Apple did this, nor did I care, and I don't think this is unique for me. I think most people will buy products because of their reviews, other people have them, their connectivity, their functionality. So but the idea that it's a why, it's a vision, that sounds more compelling. That might say as a leader, I don't need to get involved in the boring stuff, making sure that all the wiring is correct and everything works. I can just create a vision, and that's something that many people think is much more compelling.
Yeah, it makes sense. Stories are very powerful.